You think you know pirates, the daring rogues with black flags, buried treasure, and a mug of rum in hand? Well, buckle up, because the real pirates were far darker than any Hollywood fantasy dares to admit. Men who turned victory into carnage, dragging screaming girls across blood-slick decks as casually as they looted gold. Captains who declared their captives wives in drunken mock ceremonies, turning marriage into a grotesque parody of ownership. Crews that forced women to dance for their amusement before auctioning them off like spoils in a marketplace of humiliation. These weren't tales of passion and freedom at sea. They were nightmares carved into the timbers of ships that doubled as prisons. In pirate havens, women became currency, traded for rum, weapons, or loyalty. At sea, they became sea wives to entire crews, stripped of identity, dignity, and hope. And for those deemed no longer valuable, the ocean itself became their grave, their cries swallowed by the waves. You're about to uncover the shocking practices that strip away every romantic myth about piracy. From the blood-soaked decks of capture to the cruel parody of forced marriages, from floating brothels on the waves to punishments designed to break body and spirit. These are the truths that will make the legends of pirate romance collapse into horror. Behind every black flag was a reality more terrifying than any tale of buried treasure. The crack of cannon fire was only the beginning. Within minutes, smoke swallowed the ship and the deck became chaos. Splintered wood, fallen men, and the wild laughter of raiders leaping over the rails. For the pirates, this was victory. For the captives, it was the end of freedom. Pirates didn't just seize gold and cargo, they seized people. Girls and young women were dragged across blood-slick planks, torn from families in the same breath that claimed lives. Their screams joined the crash of waves as they were hauled below deck or forced to kneel in front of the crew. The act of taking them was immediate and deliberate. It wasn't only about desire, it was about domination. To the pirates, a captured girl wasn't a passenger or a daughter anymore. She was plunder, a trophy, proof of power. And the message was clear. Nothing on this ship was beyond their reach. From that moment forward, her identity was rewritten. She wasn't someone's child or someone's sister. She was spoils of war for the men who claimed her. The conquest of flesh was as routine as the conquest of ships. For her, it was the start of a nightmare with no escape. The legends of swashbuckling rogues rarely admit this part. They leave out the reality that for many, the first taste of piracy was the taste of captivity, freedom replaced with chains, dignity replaced with fear. After a raid, chaos gave way to hierarchy. The captain always took first pick, not only of the gold, but of the people. Captives weren't just prisoners, some were turned into what pirates mockingly called wives. The word carried none of its usual meaning. There were no vows, no bonds of affection, only ownership disguised as legitimacy. A girl could find herself declared the bride of a captain before the entire crew, her fate sealed in a drunken proclamation. From that moment, her world shrank to a cabin she could never leave, and a man whose word was law. This grotesque parody of marriage was more about symbolism than sentiment. To the captain, keeping a wife projected authority, proof that he had power not only over ships but over lives. To the crew, it was theater, a ritual that blurred cruelty into custom. The title of wife offered no shield. If the captain wished, he could share her, trade her, or abandon her at the next port. She was property, dressed in the costume of respectability. The crew jeered, the world watched, and she endured. Stories and films paint pirate captains as roguish lovers, men of passion and charm. The truth was darker. These so-called marriages were not partnerships, they were cages. Behind the romantic myth was a reality of captivity where survival meant silence, submission, and the hope of outlasting the voyage. When the cannons grew quiet and the plunder was secured, pirate decks became stages of humiliation. Captured girls, trembling with exhaustion, were dragged before the crew and ordered to dance. There were no instruments, only the pounding of boots on wooden planks and the drunken howls of men waving mugs of rum. What began as entertainment was in truth ritual degradation, an act designed to strip captives of dignity, turning terror into spectacle. The girls were forced to sway, stumble, and twirl while laughter echoed around them. Every misstep was mocked. Some were slapped, others had clothing ripped away to provoke cheers from the crew. The line between amusement and assault blurred quickly. A drunken hand would grab too tightly, a shove would send one sprawling, and soon the dance became an excuse for further violation. For the pirates, this was more than cruelty. It was control. By forcing captives to perform in front of jeering men, they broke spirits before chains ever touched wrists. The message was clear. Resistance was useless, privacy impossible, and shame eternal. Many girls were so young they could barely understand the ritual, but instinct taught them the truth. This wasn't entertainment, it was dominance rehearsed in public. And the worst part? These performances often ended with auctions of the very dancers, men tossing dice or drawing lots to see who would take her next. Her dance steps became the measure of her value. Her trembling body reduced to a prize in a grotesque lottery. On pirate ships, degradation was not hidden, it was celebrated. When pirate crews reached havens like Nassau, Tortuga, or Port Royal, the chaos of the sea spilled into the taverns and brothels. Here, women were not just victims, they were currency. A captured girl could be traded for weapons, shared among allies, or sold outright for silver and rum. In these lawless ports, human flesh carried more weight than gold. Pirates strutted through the streets with their wives or captives on display, as if parading treasure. Deals were struck in smoky taverns, a night with a girl for a keg of rum, permanent ownership for a pistol or musket. For some, women became bargaining chips in pirate politics, tokens of loyalty, gifts for sealing alliances, even bribes to stave off mutiny. The women themselves had no voice. Some were locked in filthy rooms above taverns, serving as entertainment for entire crews. Others were passed hand to hand, disappearing into the shadows of the ports without record or mercy. Many simply vanished, sold to slavers, or abandoned when no longer profitable. These exchanges blurred the lines between piracy and commerce. Sex was not just indulgence. It was a marketplace, a trade network as brutal as any exchange of stolen sugar or tobacco. Pirate havens thrived on this economy of exploitation, where every girl's body had a price and no man questioned the transaction. What Hollywood paints as lively, rum-soaked nights of freedom were, in reality, markets of flesh. Here, the human cost of piracy was not hidden in shadows. It was laid bare in the open streets, where laughter, music, and screams mingled under the torchlight. Pirate life was not just about plunder, it was about belonging to a brotherhood forged in blood and rum. But to enter that world, new recruits often faced brutal trials designed to strip away fear and test loyalty. These rituals were not confined to swords or fists. Sometimes they were twisted spectacles of humiliation involving captives. In the glow of lanterns below deck, the crew gathered in a circle, bottles passing from hand to hand. A trembling recruit would be shoved into the center, the jeering voices of hardened men closing in. His task wasn't just to prove courage in battle, but to prove obedience to the code of cruelty that ruled the ship. Captives, already stripped of dignity, became unwilling instruments in these performances. To refuse meant ridicule, suspicion, even punishment from the very men whose acceptance he needed to survive. To participate meant crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. It was a trap by design. A baptism of degradation meant to bind the newcomer to the crew with guilt and complicity. The pirates cheered, laughed, and drank as if it were a festival, but beneath the noise was a sinister purpose, turning boys into monsters by forcing them to share in the shame. From that moment, the recruit wasn't just a sailor, he was part of the brotherhood, tied to its crimes, unable to break away without exposing himself. This was how piracy perpetuated itself. Violence wasn't only taken out on enemies. It was carved into the souls of its own men, ensuring no one left the ship without blood on their hands and darkness in their hearts. Not every captive was claimed by a single captain. Some were forced into an even harsher fate, becoming sea wives to entire crews. On ships where hierarchy was loose and discipline fragile, women were made into shared property, shuffled from hammock to hammock like living spoils. Imagine the reality of such a life. The cramped lower deck, damp and reeking of salt and sweat. Hammocks swaying in the dark as men took their turns, their laughter echoing through the timbers. For the woman, there was no rest, no escape. Day bled into night in an endless cycle of exhaustion, her body treated as another piece of ship's equipment, used, worn, and discarded. These women were often forced to serve practical roles during the day, cooking, mending, cleaning, only to be dragged back into the nightmare after nightfall. Some crews even assigned rotation schedules, coldly treating human beings as though they were rations to be divided. And yet, amid the cruelty, survival instincts sometimes surfaced in unexpected ways. A woman who managed to win the protection of a powerful crew member could secure slightly better treatment, but that fragile shield could vanish with a mutiny or a storm, leaving her exposed once more. For pirates, this system was less about pleasure and more about control. By dehumanizing captives so completely, they reinforced the law of the sea: the strong take, the weak obey. For the women trapped in it, the long voyage was less an adventure across oceans than a slow drowning of identity and hope. Some pirate ships became floating prisons of exploitation, where captives were kept not for ransom, but for ongoing use. These vessels earned a whispered reputation as brothels on the waves. Life aboard them was a nightmare stretched over weeks, months, sometimes years. In the darkness below deck, women were quartered like livestock, chained or locked away until the crew demanded their presence. They were given scraps for food, little water, and no chance of escape. The creak of the timbers, the sway of the ship, the smell of salt and mildew, all became the backdrop to their captivity. When ships docked in pirate havens, the nightmare deepened. Captives were paraded into taverns, offered up as hospitality for allies, or rented out to crews in exchange for weapons and supplies. Some were branded with marks to identify which ship they belonged to, like property stamped with ownership. Their bodies became currency, traded in the same way as barrels of sugar or crates of tobacco. The system was brutal, but profitable. Pirates who chose this path didn't just raid, they ran a business of exploitation, feeding the hunger of lawless ports. For the captives, each docking meant fresh eyes upon them, new hands bargaining their worth. Few ever escaped. Those who grew sick or were no longer desirable often vanished quietly, discarded at sea without ceremony. The romantic vision of the free pirate roaming the seas for gold collapses under this reality. These ships were not symbols of freedom. They were prisons without walls, where the ocean itself became a chain, ensuring that cries for help never reached a shore. Pirate discipline was harsh, but it was also theatrical. Power was not just enforced by the cutlass, it was enforced by humiliation, and nothing was more feared than sexual punishment. When a captive disobeyed, or when a crew member was accused of betrayal, the reprisals went beyond whips and ropes. Punishments were staged to break not just the body, but the spirit. Victims were sometimes stripped, mocked, and paraded before the crew, their dignity torn away in full view of laughing men. The act itself became a warning. Obedience was survival. Defiance was annihilation. Captains wielded this terror with precision. A girl who resisted too fiercely might be given over to the crew, a phrase that carried unspoken horror. A sailor suspected of cowardice could be subjected to ritual humiliation designed to emasculate him in the eyes of his brothers. In a world where honor and dominance were the currency of life, Such punishments marked a man forever, or drove him to a watery grave by his own hand. The cruelty had purpose. By using degradation as spectacle, pirates ensured fear outweighed rebellion. No one wanted to become the next example, the next body tossed to the sharks after enduring the jeers of their comrades. This was how order was maintained aboard ships that otherwise lived without law. Violence was currency, and humiliation was interest. In the shadows of these punishments, loyalty wasn't born of respect. It was born of terror, and terror, at sea, was a tool as reliable as steel. Not every captive survived the voyage. For many, their final fate came quietly, not in the chaos of cannon fire, but in the stillness of night. When a woman was considered used up, too sick to work, or simply no longer valuable, pirates had a grim solution. She was cast overboard. It rarely happened in daylight. Instead, under a moonlit sky, the crew would drag her to the rail. Sometimes bound, sometimes too weak to resist, she was lifted over the side and released into the dark water. The splash was small, quickly swallowed by the sea, but for those watching, it was unforgettable. Within moments, the ocean erased all trace, waves closing over her, sharks circling beneath, silence returning as though she had never existed. To the pirates, this was not murder. It was practicality. A sick or unwilling captive consumed food and space. A body thrown overboard was a problem erased. There were no prayers, no markers, no graves, only salt water and shadows. The ship sailed on as though nothing had happened. The terror of this fate hung over every captive like a storm cloud. Each day alive was a fragile victory, each night a gamble that they would see the sunrise. Survival depended not only on endurance, but on luck, the fickle whim of men whose power over life and death was absolute. The myths of hidden treasure never mention the greater secret the sea holds. The bones of the forgotten, women discarded like cargo, their stories lost to the depths. Hollywood has dressed pirates in charm, roguish smiles, daring kisses, forbidden love beneath the stars, but strip away the fantasy, and the truth is colder, harsher, and far more terrifying. The reality was a world where intimacy was never private, where marriages were cages, where women were traded, humiliated, and discarded like plunder. For men, too, the threat of humiliation and accusation kept them locked in a performance of dominance they could never step away from. There was no freedom in the pirate's bedroom, only the constant assertion of power. Yet the myth endures, built on fragments of truth twisted into legend. Pirates did laugh, did drink, did sing beneath the sails, but behind those songs was a world of suffering scrubbed from the stories we prefer to tell. The image of a pirate sweeping a woman into his arms on a moonlit beach is a lie that hides the reality of a woman dragged screaming across a deck. Why do we cling to the fantasy? Perhaps because it is easier to romanticize than to confront, easier to imagine passion than to acknowledge brutality. But history doesn't exist to comfort us. It exists to remind us of what people are capable of, when power has no restraint. The true pirate world was not a tale of love on the high seas. It was a stage for dominance, exploitation, and survival against impossible odds. The romance was invented centuries later. The horror was real.